Attorney Vance slid a tattered old piece of paper toward me. My son-in-law Brad immediately burst out laughing. The dry, arrogant sound echoed through the room. He sprang to his feet. He looked at me with utter contempt. Then he walked closer, his voice dripping with smugness. "You're just a stupid old plumber, an uneducated man. Your whole life, all you've done is clean up trash and smell sewer lines. What would you even do with money, if it went to you? You'd just waste it at hardware stores. Leave the assets to someone educated, someone who knows how to manage things, someone like me. Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. Grab a drink, some snacks, sit back, relax, and remember the people in these stories always had every opportunity to do the right thing, they simply chose not to. Leave a number 1 inch the comments so we can continue the story, and hit subscribe. You're going to enjoy this one." I sat in Attorney Vance's office. The room was on the 14th floor. Cold, gray glass walls surrounded us. Eleanor had been gone for exactly 2 weeks. The faint scent of lavender still clung to the collar of my jacket. It was the only thing keeping me from collapsing. Across from me sat Chloe. My daughter looked exhausted. Beside her was Brad. My well-dressed son-in-law wore a custom-tailored suit. He kept adjusting his expensive silk tie. He looked around the room as if he were appraising property. His gaze settled on my rough, calloused hands. A slight sneer curled across his lips. Attorney Vance flipped through a stack of documents. His voice was steady and emotionless. "According to the legally binding will of Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, the entire family home and $47,000 worth of Con Ed stock shall be transferred to her daughter Chloe. Mr. Stephen will receive nothing except a small piece of paper." I froze. My chest tightened with pain. Eleanor had left nothing for me. Was 40 years of marriage worth nothing more than this emptiness? The pain was made even worse as my son-in-law continued mocking me in front of my daughter and the attorney. Chloe tugged lightly on her husband's sleeve and told Brad not to talk like that. But Brad simply waved her off. He carried himself like a victorious man. I looked straight into his eyes, with absolute contempt. I had no need to argue. My plumber's hands clenched into fists. Slowly, I smoothed out Eleanor's small note. Then, I slipped it deep into my pocket. What I didn't know then was that this little piece of paper was the beginning of a shocking truth. I stepped out of the glass building into the chill of the late afternoon. Brad and Chloe sped off ahead of me in their gleaming BMW. They did not even wait. I slowly made my way toward the bus stop. The cold wind slipped through the collar of my coat. The scent of Eleanor's lavender seemed to have faded a little more. My chest felt completely hollow. 40 years together. I had worked day and night without complaint. I repaired countless water lines. I crawled through dark basements to provide for my family. Yet Eleanor had left everything to Chloe and her arrogant husband. This betrayal hurt more than any wound I had ever endured. By the time I arrived home, darkness had already settled in. The suburban wooden house stood silent and cold. No warm yellow light welcomed me inside. No sound of Eleanor watching television in the living room. I sat down on the old sofa with its worn corners. Every part of the house carried traces of her. The handmade rugs, the landscape paintings hanging on the walls. I slipped my hand into my pocket and felt Eleanor's small note. With trembling fingers, I pulled it out beneath the dim light. My wife's familiar handwriting appeared before me. "Go to our bedroom. Under the 3rd floorboard from the closet, you will find the answer." My heart began pounding. I jumped to my feet and hurried into the bedroom. Dropping to my knees, I pried up the wooden floorboard with my calloused hands. Just as she had written, beneath the dark hollow space sat an old oak box. It was the same box Eleanor had always kept locked during her lifetime. She used to say it contained memories from her girlhood. I lifted it onto the bed. Dust covered the lid. Nearby, I found a small key hidden exactly where she had left it. I slid the key into the lock. The dry click echoed through the silent room. The lid opened. I froze. A rich wave of familiar lavender fragrance drifted out from inside. There was no cash, no gold. Instead, dozens of letters lay neatly bundled together with a blue ribbon. Every envelope was marked with a date. The first letter had been written 40 years ago, shortly after our wedding day. I picked up the top letter. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped it. What had Eleanor been writing in these letters for 40 years? Why had she hidden them so carefully from me? What connection did this secret have to the fortune Brad had just claimed? I took a deep breath and slowly opened the very first letter. Eleanor's handwriting and ink from 40 years ago were still perfectly clear. She had written the letter to me on a night when I had to leave during a blizzard to handle an emergency plumbing repair. Eleanor wrote that she had watched me walk out the door in my stained work clothes, yet with eyes full of responsibility. She was proud of me. She wrote that my calloused plumber's hands were the strongest support in the world. I continued reading the letters that followed. One letter was written in 1990 when I had saved every spare dollar to buy Chloe her first bicycle. Eleanor praised my integrity and quiet kindness. She called me a genius when it came to building a happy family. Tears streamed down my face, blurring the words on the page. I cried openly in the empty room. Drops of water fell onto the rough paper. I had been wrong. I had believed Eleanor looked down on my profession the way Brad did. But she did not. She cherished every drop of sweat I had shed. She loved every callus on these hands. The letters carrying Eleanor's warmth across the years soothed the pain of the humiliation I had suffered in Attorney Vance's office. Brad had degrees. He possessed the cunning of a finance man, but he would never have the respect and pure love that Eleanor had given me. I turned to the letters from the last 10 years. The tone of Eleanor's writing began to change. She wrote about Brad. She wrote that she had seen through his arrogance and greed from the very first day he entered our home. Eleanor realized Brad had married Chloe only because he had his eyes on our house and our savings. She knew that if she openly left her assets to me, Brad would find every possible way to exploit me and eventually leave me with nothing. Eleanor had foreseen the scene that had unfolded today, the scene where my son-in-law humiliated me in Attorney Vance's office. In her final letter, she wrote that she had been forced to appear cold and distant in her will in order to protect me. It was the only way to convince Brad that I was penniless and no longer worth using. I reached the bottom of the oak box. Beneath the thick bundle of letters was a layer of red velvet. I ran my hand along the bottom of the box. My fingers touched something hard and cold. Metal. I lifted the velvet cloth. A heavy brass key was revealed. Engraved on its shaft in sharp lettering was a single number, 247. Beside the key lay another small note from Eleanor. Her message was brief. Take this key to First National Bank tomorrow morning. Then you will understand why I did this. Take care, my love. I stared at the key marked 247. My mind spun with questions. First National Bank was where Eleanor had worked part-time when she was young. What did this key open there? What had Eleanor hidden from me behind the doors of that bank? I closed my hand tightly around the key. The cold metal seemed to urge me forward. That night, I could not sleep at all. I wanted only one thing. For morning to come, early the next morning, I put on the most respectable clothes I owned. I caught the first bus into downtown. The key marked 247 rested quietly inside my coat pocket. I could feel its weight even through the fabric. First National Bank greeted me with towering marble columns and an air of authority. My footsteps echoed across the polished floor. I walked to the customer service desk. A young employee greeted me with a polite smile. I presented the brass key and explained that I wanted to access a safe deposit box. She checked the information in the system and then escorted me downstairs. The heavy steel door protecting the vault opened with a dry metallic groan. The air below felt thick and carried the scent of old paper. She guided me to box number 247. I inserted the key. A click echoed through the room. The small steel door swung open. Inside sat a long metal container. The employee gave me a courteous nod and stepped outside to ensure my privacy. I pulled the metal box out and placed it on a small table in the corner. My heart pounded against my ribs. Slowly, I lifted the lid. I nearly cried out in shock. The box was packed with old stock certificates dating back to the 1980s. The papers were decorated with intricate designs and stained by time. I picked up the first bundle. Microsoft stock certificates from 1,996. The next stack belonged to Waste Management. Then came certificates from major energy companies and public utility corporations. I turned through the documents one by one in complete disbelief. Every certificate was registered in the names of Eleanor Walsh and Stephen Walsh. My wife had purchased them decades ago and quietly stored them here all these years. I began adding up the figures printed on the pages. The number of shares was beyond imagination. A plumber like me had never seen that many zeros on a single piece of paper. This was not a few $1,000s in ordinary savings. This was a genuine treasure accumulated over nearly half a century. My head spun. I had to grip the edge of the table to steady myself. How had Eleanor acquired such an enormous collection of stocks? Where had the money come from to buy them year after year? As I searched through the thick stacks of certificates, I noticed another familiar blue envelope tucked among them. My breath caught. Only Eleanor used those blue envelopes. Slowly I reached for it. The paper felt fragile with age. On the front, written in the same elegant handwriting I knew by heart, was a single line. To my stubborn husband when he finally discovers what we built together. My hands began to tremble again. Whatever answer I had come here seeking, I knew it was waiting inside that envelope. I opened the blue envelope with hands that would not stop trembling. Eleanor's handwriting appeared on the page. Her words felt as though she were whispering directly into my ear. Eleanor explained everything. For 40 years she had quietly set aside $20 to $30 from every paycheck I earned as a plumber. Back then, I had done nothing but work hard and hand my entire income to my wife to manage. I had never once questioned how she handled the household finances. Eleanor had used those small amounts to purchase shares in technology and energy companies while they were still in their infancy. She reinvested every dividend for decades. The quiet persistence of a devoted wife had created a financial miracle. In the letter, Eleanor carefully listed the figures for me to verify. We owned $47,000 in Con Ed stock. We owned $123,000 in Microsoft stock. And based on current market values, the total assets inside this safe deposit box had grown to $3.2 million. $3.2 million. The number nearly took my breath away. I was an old plumber who had spent his life handling sweat-stained paychecks and small bills. Now I stood before a fortune worth millions. Eleanor wrote that she had quietly transformed a plumber's wages into this wealth to protect me from Brad's arrogance. She knew my son-in-law would always look down on me if all I had was an ordinary savings account. Eleanor wanted to give him a lesson he would never forget. At exactly the right moment, tears fell once again. I could feel the depth of my wife's love and sacrifice. She had lived modestly her entire life. She drove an old car. She wore outdated clothes. She did it all to build a secure future for me. I hugged the stock certificates to my chest. For the first time since her death, I no longer felt alone. Eleanor was still here, still protecting me in her own way. Carefully, I packed every stock certificate and all the documents representing the $3.2 million into a small leather bag. I thanked the bank employee and walked back out onto the street. This time I walked differently. The hesitation was gone. My shoulders were straight. My chest was filled with pride. Brad believed he had been clever when he took possession of the old house and $47,000 in stock. He had no idea that those assets were nothing more than a grain of sand compared to the desert I now held in my hands. I returned home and placed the leather bag inside the drawer of my desk. Then I sat down and made myself a cup of tea. At that very moment, the shrill ring of the telephone shattered the silence. Brad's name appeared on the screen. I answered. My son-in-law's voice came through immediately. Urgent, demanding, as though he were already giving orders. Stephen, listen carefully. Chloe and I have been discussing the house. The property is old and frankly, it's a burden for someone your age. We've decided it would be best if you moved out within the next 30 days. We can help you find a small apartment somewhere. Don't make this difficult. I slowly lowered my teacup. A faint smile appeared on my face. Brad had no idea that everything he believed about me was wrong, and he certainly had no idea that Eleanor's final plan was only beginning to unfold. He informed me that he was coming to my house immediately. 15 minutes later, the engine of the BMW roared into the driveway. A car door slammed shut with unnecessary force. Brad walked into the house without even bothering to knock. He was still wearing the same expensive suit from Attorney Vance's office. He glanced around the living room with obvious disgust. Then he pulled a thick stack of documents from his jacket and threw them onto the wooden table in front of me. Brad sat down across from me. Crossing one leg over the other, he adjusted his cufflinks and began speaking in a patronizing tone. He told me to sign the property transfer documents. He said the house now belonged to Chloe. He claimed he had carefully calculated every expense involved. Using the artificial sophistication of a finance professional, he tried to overwhelm me with numbers. Brad explained that if I remained in the house, maintenance costs and property taxes would bankrupt me within 2 years. According to him, the best option for an aging plumber past his prime was to move into a nursing home on the outskirts of town. He had even selected a cheap facility for me. I listened quietly. I did not interrupt him once. I took a small sip of my now cold tea. Out of the corner of my eye, I glanced toward the desk drawer beside me. Inside that drawer sat stock documents worth $3.2 million. The sheer audacity of my son-in-law was both amusing and revolting. He was so proud of his degree and his collection of hollow financial theories. He believed he could corner his father-in-law, seize the house, sell it, and use the proceeds for his own investments. When Brad saw my silence, he assumed I was frightened. He pushed a pen toward me and ordered me to sign. He told me to stop being stubborn. He said I lacked the education to understand cash flow and asset management. Slowly, I set my teacup on the table. Then I looked directly into his eyes. The greed in them was impossible to hide. I pushed his documents away. I looked at Brad and spoke a single sentence. I won't sign anything, and I'm not going anywhere. Brad slammed his hand against the table and jumped to his feet. His face turned bright red with anger. He threatened to use the law to throw me out of the house. He said I would regret my stubbornness. I remained seated. A small smile appeared on my face. Then I invited him to return to Attorney Vance's office the following morning. I told him I had a very big surprise waiting for him and Chloe. Brad stormed out of the house. At the doorway, he let out a mocking laugh filled with challenge and contempt. The BMW engine roared again moments later as he sped away. The sound faded into the distance. I sat alone in the quiet house. For the first time, I felt no anger, no fear, only anticipation. I opened the desk drawer and looked at the leather bag containing the stock certificates. $3.2 million. But the money itself was not what mattered most. The real treasure Eleanor had left behind was her foresight. She had predicted every move Brad would make, every insult, every threat, every greedy calculation. Tomorrow morning, Brad would walk into Attorney Vance's office believing he was the smartest person in the room, and tomorrow morning was the moment Eleanor's final lesson would begin. The next morning, I returned to Attorney Vance's office. The room was just as cold and sterile as it had been the day before. Brad and Chloe were already there waiting. The moment Brad saw me walk in, a triumphant smile spread across his face. He leaned toward Chloe and whispered something in her ear before looking at me with open challenge. He thought this plumber had come to surrender. He thought I was there to sign away the house and quietly accept a place in a nursing home. But I had not come alone. Standing beside me was Evelyn Sinclair. She was one of the city's most respected senior financial advisors. Evelyn wore an elegant business suit and carried a thick leather briefcase. The moment Attorney Vance saw her, he immediately rose to greet her with obvious respect. Her presence changed the atmosphere in the room at once. Brad frowned. Confusion flashed across his face. Then he spoke in a mocking tone. He demanded to know who I had brought with me and what kind of stunt I was trying to pull. I remained silent. I took my seat. Then I nodded to Evelyn. It was time. Evelyn Sinclair opened her briefcase and removed a thick stack of documents. She placed them firmly on the mahogany table. Her voice was calm, clear, and precise. I am the authorized representative of the investment portfolio belonging to Eleanor Walsh and Stephen Walsh. Then she began presenting the contents of the safe deposit box at First National Bank. She read every figure aloud. $47,000 in Con Ed stock, $123,000 in Microsoft stock, and a current total portfolio value of $3.2 million. The room fell into a suffocating silence. The smile vanished from Brad's face. He froze. His mouth dropped open. His eyes locked onto the documents lying on the table. He could not believe what he had just heard. An old plumber covered in sweat and grime was the owner of a multi-million-dollar fortune. Brad stammered helplessly. His face turned pale from shock. Chloe looked equally stunned. She stared at me, then at the stock certificates, then back at me again. This revelation was beyond anything anyone in that room had imagined. Brad finally tried to recover. He shot to his feet. This is impossible, his voice cracked. It has to be a mistake. Or some kind of scam. He pointed directly at me. A stupid plumber cannot possibly have that kind of money. If you've made it this far, then you're probably enjoying this story. Please do us a quick favor, like and subscribe. Leave a number 5 inches the comments so I know you've watched this far and tell me your prediction for how the story ends. Let's see if you're right. A lot of people watch without doing that, but it costs you nothing and means a great deal to us. Evelyn Sinclair merely smiled at Brad's loss of control. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of someone watching a man dig his own grave. Then she reached into her briefcase one final time. She withdrew a single sheet of paper. It bore Eleanor's original signature. Evelyn placed the letter carefully on the table. Then she looked directly into Brad's eyes. This, she said, is a special letter Eleanor left behind for anyone who attempted to challenge her estate. Brad stopped breathing for a moment. The room became silent. Even Attorney Vance leaned forward. Slowly, Evelyn unfolded the letter, and for the first time since Eleanor's death, it felt as though she herself had entered the room. Evelyn Sinclair began reading Eleanor's special letter. Her voice was firm and carried throughout Attorney Vance's office. To Brad and to all those greedy people who view life through the lens of empty credentials. Every dollar contained within this $3.2 million fortune came from Stephen's sweat and hard work. Brad may possess advanced financial degrees, but he is completely blind to the values that truly matter in life. Stephen is only a plumber, but he possesses a heart of gold and unwavering loyalty to his family. Those qualities are the foundation of real wealth, and they are qualities an arrogant man like Brad will never understand. Every line of Eleanor's letter landed like a slap across my son-in-law's face. Brad's cheeks flushed red. Then all color drained away. He stood frozen, speechless. The arrogance that usually filled the room whenever he entered had completely vanished. The hands that normally adjusted his expensive tie with confidence were now trembling uncontrollably. He lowered his gaze toward the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Attorney Vance slowly shook his head. Chloe covered her mouth and began sobbing from embarrassment. Evelyn continued reading. The final section of Eleanor's letter changed everything. Furthermore, the entire $3.2 million portfolio shall be placed into a trust over which Stephen Walsh has complete authority and discretion. Neither Chloe nor Brad shall receive a single dollar without Stephen's express approval. The family home inherited by Chloe shall also remain subject to oversight. Should Brad attempt to pressure Stephen into leaving the property, all benefits available to Chloe through this trust shall be immediately revoked. Silence filled the room. A long, crushing silence. The victory of integrity could almost be felt in the air. I remained seated and watched my son-in-law collapse beneath the weight of the truth. For the first time in weeks, my chest felt light. Eleanor had restored justice for me in a way more perfect than I could ever have imagined. I did not need to use money to humiliate Brad. I did not need revenge. My silence combined with the fortune built through honest labor was punishment enough for his greed. The meeting ended in humiliation for Chloe and Brad. Brad shuffled toward the door without daring to look directly at me. The confidence he had worn like armor was gone. The multi-million-dollar fortune was now entirely under my control. But the story did not end there. In the months that followed, that fortune transformed the dynamics of my family completely. The day after the meeting, my phone began ringing. First Chloe called, then Brad, then Chloe again. The people who had been eager to send me to a nursing home suddenly wanted family dinners. They wanted conversations. They wanted forgiveness. And above all, they wanted access. But Eleanor had spent 40 years teaching me a lesson that money alone could never buy. The value of a person is not measured by a title, a degree, or a bank account. It is measured by character. Brad had spent years believing that wealth made him superior. Yet the fortune he coveted had been built by the very man he mocked. An old plumber. A husband. A father. A man whose greatest asset had never been the millions hidden in a bank vault. It had been the trust of the woman who loved him for 40 years. 6 months passed quickly after the dramatic confrontation in Attorney Vance's office. My life had changed in many ways, yet I chose to remain in the old house. I still cared for Eleanor's lavender garden with my own hands. One weekend afternoon, a hesitant knock sounded at the door. I opened it and was surprised to find Brad standing there. The arrogance that had once defined him was completely gone. He was no longer dressed in expensive custom-tailored suits. Instead, he wore simple clothes and lowered his head when he saw me. Brad awkwardly asked if he could come inside. Without a word, I stepped aside and allowed him to enter. He sat down on the old worn sofa with unusual humility. Then he looked at me with genuine remorse in his eyes. Brad began apologizing for everything that had happened. He admitted that he had been completely wrong to judge a person's worth by degrees, titles, or appearances. The arrogant son-in-law I once knew had finally learned a lesson about humility. Just then Chloe walked in behind him. My daughter's face glowed with a happiness I could not immediately understand. She came over and gently took my rough plumber's hands into hers. With tears in her eyes, she shared wonderful news. She was 2 months pregnant. I was going to become a grandfather. The announcement felt like warm sunlight pouring into a heart that had been lonely for far too long. The anger, the disappointment, the feeling of betrayal, all of it seemed to melt away. I wrapped my arms around my daughter and once again tears filled my eyes. This time they were tears of happiness. I turned toward Brad. He remained standing quietly in the corner of the room, filled with regret. I gave him a small nod, a silent gesture of forgiveness. I promised Chloe that I would always be there for her and Brad, and that I would play an important role in the life of my future grandchild. The reconciliation brought a sense of peace unlike anything I had felt in years. After Chloe and Brad left, I sat alone in the quiet living room. I looked up at Eleanor's photograph hanging on the wall. Then I smiled. Everything had unfolded exactly as she had hoped. Integrity had been honored, and our family had found its way back to genuine love. Yet the $3.2 million in the trust still remained. I needed to make one final decision about how to use that fortune in a way that would create the greatest possible good. That evening I opened Eleanor's final blue envelope. It was one I had saved for last. Inside was a brief handwritten note. The ink had faded slightly, but her words were still clear. My love, if you are reading this, then our family has healed. That means the money has already served its first purpose. Now let it serve its second. Do not use it to make people rich. Use it to make lives better. Love when shared always grows. I sat quietly for a long time after reading those words. Then I finally understood. The following month I established the Eleanor Walsh Trade Scholarship Fund. The trust would provide scholarships for students entering skilled trades, plumbers, electricians, mechanics, welders, and construction workers. Young people who worked with their hands. Young people who were often overlooked by those who believed success only came with prestigious degrees. The first scholarship ceremony took place 1 year later. 24 students received financial assistance. Many of them came from families that struggled just as mine once had. As I stood at the podium, I looked out at the audience. In the front row sat Chloe. Beside her was Brad, and in Chloe's arms was my granddaughter. A little girl with Eleanor's eyes. Brad stood and applauded alongside everyone else. Not because of the money, not because of the trust, but because he finally understood the lesson Eleanor had spent 40 years teaching. Wealth is not what sits in a bank account. Character is. A degree can earn respect. Money can create comfort, but neither can replace integrity, loyalty, and love. Those were the true investments Eleanor made throughout her life. And unlike stocks, houses, or trust funds, their value never stops growing. I decided to use the $3.2 million fortune in the most meaningful way possible. I did not buy luxury cars or a grand mansion. Instead, I quietly used the money to help struggling neighbors. I established a scholarship fund in Eleanor's name that covered the full tuition costs of underprivileged children in our community. I sponsored young people who dreamed of pursuing skilled trades and hands-on professions, jobs that often go unnoticed but remain the backbone of society. As for me, I continued living simply in the old house. I still repaired plumbing for elderly neighbors who lived alone, never charging them a single dollar for my work. Every late afternoon, I would sit on the familiar front porch. I would look out at Eleanor's lavender garden blooming in full color, filling the air with its sweet fragrance. Sometimes I would raise my hands and study them carefully. The rough plumber's hands, the hands covered in calluses earned through decades of work. I felt deeply proud of them. These hands had provided for my family. These hands had helped me earn Eleanor's extraordinary love, and now they were bringing hope to countless people whose lives had been touched by hardship. Have you ever been judged unfairly because of your appearance or your profession? Leave a comment below and join our community by liking and subscribing for more true-to-life stories of betrayal, resilience, and redemption. And as always, thank you for being part of this space. My life story stands as a simple reminder. A person's true value is never found in an impressive title printed on a business card. It is not found in framed degrees hanging on a wall. True worth is found in character, integrity, and the quiet ways we choose to love and serve others throughout our lives. Those who judge people solely by appearances eventually discover a painful truth. Arrogance creates loneliness. Greed creates emptiness. But honesty, humility, and loyalty leave behind something far greater than wealth. They leave behind a legacy. And that was the greatest gift Eleanor ever gave me.